Welcome back to the Nick Taylor Horror Show. So, as we put the literal horror show of 2020 behind us, I felt it was really important to kick off this new year with an episode about somebody that we lost last year who left a tremendous void in the horror community. And that, of course, is Stuart Gordon. To call Stewart a boundary pusher would be such an understatement. Stewart taught entire generations of horror directors how to not just push boundaries, but decimate them. And by doing so, show audiences the true power of horror. Stewart meant a lot of things to a lot of people, and one of the most recurring themes of conversations I've had with people about him is just how dedicated he was to mentorship and the craft of art. I was fortunate enough to have conducted one of the last interviews with Stewart last year, and I highly recommend hearing that conversation if you haven't already. My conversation with Stewart was right after he had written his autobiography, so he was very reflective of his entire life story and was incredibly generous with his wisdom. So check out that episode if you have not already. It's great, and I was pinching myself the entire time because it was such a privilege to speak to him. For this episode, I wanted to dig deeper into Stewart's prolific life by talking to some of those who were lucky enough to work with him. This episode features 3 separate conversations about Stewart with Brian Yuzna, Larry Fessenden, and Graham Skipper. Each person reflects on Stewart's life, his legacy, and what they learned from him. And I was really floored at how much insight came out of each of these conversations. Each interview turned out to be extremely practical, very revealing, and really, really fun. There's a lot of great stories about Stewart, as well as really practical filmmaking lessons as well. So you guys are in for a treat. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed these 3 conversations about the life and work of one of our fallen masters of horror, Stuart Gordon. I'm going to start with perhaps Stewart's closest collaborator, Brian Yuzna. Brian is a man who needs no introduction. A writer, director, and producer, Brian produced multiple movies that Stewart directed, including Reanimator, Dagon, From Beyond, and Dolls. Brian directed one of my personal favorite deep cuts, Society, which if you have not seen, do yourself a favor and watch it. Ideally with Joe Bob on Shudder. Brian also directed Bride of Reanimator, Silent Night, Deadly Night 4, Beyond Reanimator, Return of the Living Dead 3, which is fucking insane and fantastic, and not enough people talk about it. Brian and Stewart had a famous collaboration, and in partnership with each other were responsible for some very quintessential horror classics. As a duo, they were so unstoppable, and I was so fortunate to be able to speak with Brian in depth about their collaboration. So, without further ado, please enjoy this conversation about Stuart Gordon with Brian Yuzna. So as a director, what were some of the big lessons that you learned from Stewart as a director and as a leader?
I think I learned, to a certain degree, I kind of learned how to direct by watching the directors that I produce. I think I've produced, 10 first-time directors and a lot more that weren't first time. And I think from all of them I picked up something, but Stewart was certainly the one who was the most influential. Not that I ended up directing like him. I think maybe what I got from him was I tried to kind of osmose his ability to tell stories with actors. And that's something, I've always thought that was Stewart's great gift. And it's quite logical because Stewart, had directed theater for 10 years before he ever did his first movie.
Right.
So when we started Reanimator, we were both first timers. Everybody else on the set had worked before in the movie business. We were in Hollywood. And, but the difference was that Stewart had been directing actors and telling stories on stage for years before that. So he's a very, very talented and accomplished director of actors and teller of stories. He brought that to the movies. And I think I hope I was able to learn something from it. I don't think you really learn anything without doing.
Yeah.
And I've never directed theater, so it's a whole different type of mentality. I've always loved movies that have like lots of tricks and visual effects. And Stewart always wanted to do it like you do it on stage. So, for example, with Reanimator, of course, we couldn't afford anything. I was very much about the effects, and Stewart was determined, and his go-to tool was stage effects. We didn't have a choice. I think Reanimator has two, what we used to call visual effects, opticals, in the whole movie. There's a laser beam that Hill's using when you first see him. Believe it or not, it was a big deal to get that effect. And there was at the end when the syringe empties out.
Right.
Well, of course, I drove for those things. I would have, when Dr. Hill's head is being held in front of him, if I could have, I would have done it with blue screen. Back then, you had to do blue screen and process photography. Very complicated. Today, it's nothing. But back then, it was a big deal. And Stewart, he didn't even want to do that. It didn't matter with the budget. And at a certain degree, I've always felt like it's not just Stewart. A lot of horror, kind of independent horror directors, genre directors, and Stewart certainly to a high degree, almost work better with limitations. Better, because that's when there's maybe fewer tools, but you see a mastery of those tools. It's kind of like the difference between a string quartet and a rock group or something. And I mean, not a string quartet, like a full-blown orchestra.
Yeah.
In an orchestra, man, you've got to get every part fitting in with every other part. But if you're doing jazz or doing rock, it's a few people who are jamming, and they can really. And I think sometimes I feel like the horror movies work best with that kind of dynamic. As a matter of fact, that I once had a dinner with God, what's his name, the singer who played Renfield in the Coppola version of Dracula.
Tom Waits.
Okay, Tom Waits. And he was saying, what is this with horror movies and stuff, right? And I tried to explain it to him. He says, oh, I get it. Horror is the rock and roll of movies. There's a lot of truth in that.
A lot of truth.
And I think that's one reason why the more produced horror, the more big stuff, it has a harder time working. Which isn't to say that The Exorcist isn't incredible. You know what I mean? It's not like, I'm not saying it's a hard and fast rule. I just have noticed that so many directors like Stewart, I always felt like Stewart had the talent and that he should have been doing huge movies.
Yeah.
I see big time directors, and I kind of don't see as much ability and talent as Stewart had.
Yeah. And there's a resourcefulness sometimes when you see certain directors working with such low budgets and they're able to put something together that's palpably frightening and compelling. It's being able to use those lower budgets just forces them to be creative to a certain degree. I mean, even Rob Zombie says he prefers lower budgets because it forces you to be more creative versus all that money spoils you as a director and makes you waste.
Rob Zombie's a good example of a rock and roll director.
Oh yeah, perfect example.
And I've seen it in so many, I mean, very, very few genre directors, independent horror guys, women, to really make that leap. Somebody like Sam Raimi
Mm-hmm.
is kind of an exception to the rule. I guess maybe Wes Craven was
Right.
able to. John Carpenter kind of did, but ultimately you kind of go, boy, I like the old John Carpenter. You get up into that big area, and all of a sudden everything is so, kind of planned and goes through so many voices and so many, there's so much at stake. And the kind of, I like to listen to, jazz that has improv riffs in it.
Yeah.
I like rock and roll when they have a big solo,
Right.
I like stuff. And that's kind of what I like about horror when it works,
Mm-hmm.
But I think Stewart definitely had that, because I think all of his best stuff was the stuff that had the most restraints, and he could be the guy. And Stewart was, he was a collaborator, but he was there was, especially of course, the older we get, the more like ourselves we become. But more and more, he was the guy.
Yeah.
I saw a remembrance or a comment that his brother made after his passing. And he said he remembers when Stewart got a report card when he was like in grammar school, and the teacher put, "He's very good at directing the other kids on the playground."
That tells you a lot.
Well, I guess this was kind of in the cards.
Yeah.
But he was very obsessive. He was certainly great to collaborate with. I mean, he was always just the best at coming up with a story.
Yeah. What was your collaboration process like? Because you both were thick as thieves when you were working together.
Yeah. Well, there was a number of stages of working. I mean, you'd say that Reanimator, Dolls from Beyond is one sort of thing. Well, Reanimator would stand apart. On Dolls and From Beyond, I didn't finance that.
Mm-hmm.
So another element there. But we were still dealing in From Beyond, it was Dennis, and we all came up with the story. We all wrote the story. Dennis wrote the script. And it was always, well, the way Stewart used to put it, he said that he and I brought out the worst in each other.
Yeah, he told me that when I spoke to him.
And Dennis told me recently, said, the funny thing is that Stewart and I, we'd worked, because Stewart was Dennis's oldest friend. And he said, and they went to college together and did the theater thing together, whole thing. And we did so many projects. We did so many things. He said, we could have done anything, but you wanted to do horror. So we did horror. And I never thought of it that way, because when I first met Stewart, I had put an ad in Weekly Variety, a little ad that I paid for that said, "Horror director wanted." You can imagine how that was back before fax machines.
Wow.
How many letters I got.
Oh, wow.
And so it was like I was going to make a horror movie, because I was a horror guy. I was a horror fan. And if I'm going to risk all the money that I had in the world and go into debt, it was going to be a horror movie. But when I met Stewart, he was like and I'd met a lot of different possible directors, but I met him, I saw his plays, and we immediately got along. We immediately, I seemed to we're riffing on stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And when we developed the Reanimator script into a movie script, there was never it was me and him and Dennis. I never really dealt with William Norris, who had, according to Stewart, I think, and Dennis, had kind of created the West character.
Mm-hmm.
He was the one, they kind of credit him with coming up with that kind of irony, that kind of edge that West has that we love. I just never remember it's on Reanimator. threw a lot of ideas around. When, in the original script, it kind of was a TV pilot, and it only went as far as Halsey getting killed, and Dr. Hill wasn't in it.
Oh, that's right. It was originally going to be a TV. It was originally Reanimator was originally a TV pilot.
Yeah, and then when I had never read the stories, so then I read the stories, and I said, no, we got to have the guy with the head carrying his head around, because I always loved movies where the heads would talk and stuff. The bird that wouldn't die, and House on Haunted Hill. Whenever somebody was carrying a head around, and every time, what was the one with the head sitting on the table? But I just, that to me always was like, whoa, that's horror.
Well, you guys brought that to a whole new level.
Yeah, and I think, but that was never it was never like, I don't ever remember any kind of arguments or anything
between you and Stewart,
or me and Stewart and Dennis. It was, we were all working together for the, they were writing the script, and I was giving notes and giving my ideas but I never remember there being some kind of like well, I don't want to do it that way. I don't ever remember that even coming up. I just remember that we were just I always just thought of it like the three witches in Macbeth, we were just kind of bubble, toil and trouble, and trying to kind of come up with something, and it all just seemed wonderful,
Yeah.
And I'm very determined to have, really cool effects. Bob Greenberg, who had introduced me to Stewart, knew Tony Dublin, who was, so he brought Tony over about the effects. Tony brought in his friend, John Nolan. And then I knew John Buechler through Charlie Band, who I had been trying to make a movie with Charlie, but it never was going anywhere. And so we brought in Buechler to do kind of the more, the kind of hero like corpses.
Mm-hmm.
The bullet to the head corpse or something. The ones that were, because John Buechler had a lot of experience, but Tony Dublin just knew he's always been great at the mechanics of everything. And so I think we ended up having we did have the three of them. And
what a dream team.
Yeah, and we also had to, I know, like we ended up reshooting a lot of shots for the ending of Reanimator after we cut it, because the effects weren't working, so we had to redo the guts shooting out, and we also shot the opening then. And there were a few things that Stewart and I went back and forth about. So, for example, he didn't think we needed the prologue. When we first shot, we only had 16 days. I didn't have much money, and it was down to the pennies,
Wow.
Then when it was cut together, we needed to get these effect shots done. And a few things I thought were very important, and Stewart didn't, and vice versa. But so for example, after I saw it put together, I felt like we had to tighten it way up. I think the first cut was like over 2 hours long.
Wow.
2.5 hours or something.
A lot of people would love to see that.
Well, it's out there. It's called the integral version.
Oh, all right. I have to track that down.
It's actually a fan cut.
Okay.
In Germany, they took all the cut scenes and put them together. So it's
nice.
The TV version was longer than the theatrical version, because the TV version had a bunch of talking scenes in it, and they cut out a lot of the good stuff.
Right.
And the version that we released, which was 86 minutes, we certainly had a lot of discussion about that, because on the one hand, Stewart thought it was cut too fast. After it was released, then he said, "Hey, man, that was right." and I thought the cat was terrible.
The cat?
Yeah, because it wasn't what I expected, And so I actually got John Buechler to do another version of it. And we shot it. And it didn't work. So there you go.
I thought the cat turned out pretty great myself, but that's just me.
I agree with you. I'm just saying that you never know.
Yeah, you never can tell.
When making a movie, a lot of what happens is that you're imagining something, and when it doesn't turn out that way, you think it's not working.
Right.
But if you weren't tied into if you could give it up, you could see that maybe it is working in a different way.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big director lesson. If it doesn't work out exactly the way you see it in your mind, it doesn't mean what you have isn't great or doesn't have the opportunity to be great.
And that's one reason why when I direct, I never want to cut it myself. I would never want to edit a movie myself. A lot of people do. They want to shoot, they want to edit it, they want to direct it. And I always want an editor to look at the material and tell me what he thinks is working.
Right.
Or she. Because I'm too close to it. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's also good to have an executive producer, have people who are further distances from the project that aren't tied in with how long it took to shoot that or how much fun that was, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, more objective voices.
Like that. Oh, that's great. No, it's awful. It's great, man. That's the dynamic. And I think that's a good dynamic. And one of the things I learned from Stewart from the first time I saw him, when I went to a play that he had put on, afterwards he took questions from the audience about whether they thought it worked or not. He was developing it. And the audience, this was in Chicago, they were used to going to he ran a theater called The Organic. Mm-hmm. And they were very honest. I mean, to a degree that sometimes they would criticize stuff.
Wow. And
Stewart never was defensive. He never, I would have gotten mad, or I would have been defensive. I would have been kind of, casually offensive.
Right.
Because I would have been hurt. But Stewart would just kind of go, but of course he wouldn't do anything that he didn't want to do.
But he would listen to the feedback regardless.
No, but he listened to it and he interpreted it his own way. Mm-hmm. It's not like he went and was having a committee kind of decide whether it was working.
Right.
But I remember reading a book about the Marx Brothers movies. And the Marx Brothers, they first put their stuff out on plays. They were like wacky, crazy comedies on stage. Then they tried to bring that feeling to the movies. And when they did they would first do them as a play. And when they do the play, they would start, of course, they would go outside of New York somewhere, and they would do it and then rewrite and do it the next time.
Based on the crowd reaction?
And then rewrite and do it the next time. And rewrite and do it the next. And that's kind of the way plays are done, not as to the extreme that a farce is. Mm-hmm. But plays, they take it outside, they go to Connecticut or something, and they try it and see if it's working.
Yeah.
For some reason in the movies, we've developed this idea that the director is a genius, an artist, he's like a novelist. And even novelists have editors, by the way. So, and even the big singer-songwriters, they actually use other people's songs, mm-hmm. but they change enough to put, it all started with, Bob Dylan being a singer-songwriter. Before that, you could be a songwriter or a singer. And of course, the kind of author theory of movies started making it seem like if a director didn't write his own movie, he wasn't an artist.
Right.
And that the fact that you directed a movie somehow you're an artist. You're somebody's really, really special. It's like it's not a craft. It's like some genius that comes down. And I think that hurts a lot of movies. I think
Totally.
it hurts because you have this pretentiousness that you get from people who haven't even mastered the job.
Right. Whereas if you have the right collaborators around you, like the right writer, the right executive producer, the right collaborator, they will give you objective feedback and you craft the movie together with people who fill in for your blind spots, so to speak. Because it's easy to have blind spots with your own movie, particularly since you're so close to it. It's hard to be objective about something that you care that much about.
And I think Stewart I certainly took that from him, because I started realizing, as hard as it is to do, you just have to show what you're doing to other people and get their feedback.
Yeah, it's so important.
Of course, it's tricky because if someone's doesn't have any stake in the movie, a lot of times their opinion doesn't matter much.
Mm-hmm.
And most of your friends that you're showing it to are filmmakers themselves, so they're seeing how you should have made their movie.
That's interesting.
And so having to, it's just like you, if you put out a podcast and then you ask your friends, how do you think the podcast went? Well, you could have done, no, that's your podcast.
Right.
What do you know? So who are you really listening to, and how do you let that influence you? That's the trick. Not listening is a big mistake. Listening and thinking that somehow there's other opinions that are going to solve your problem, that's a big mistake.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a fine balance.
Well, Stewart had a very strong sense of what he wanted, and he had the chops to do it. I've seen him do stuff that had nothing to do with horror or anything. He can just tell a story. He was just really good.
Wow.
And whenever we met, whenever we would come up with projects, I've worked with a lot of people on many, many projects, most of which never got made. But you still work on it just as intensely. And there was never anybody who was that liberating when it came to storytelling, because Stewart always had that down. He always had a story concept,
Yeah.
And that's really hard. And I think it only can come, it's got to be just because he was a theater guy.
Yeah. Yeah. His theater background seems like it gave him so much knowledge and so much great instinct.
That's the key. I worked with another really, he's certainly a successful and very super interesting director, Christophe Gans, who's the French director.
Mm-hmm.
He directed an episode of the Necronomicon for me, and then I produced Crime Freeman, which was his first thing, and then he did Brotherhood of the Wolf, and probably the one that your listeners will know, which is what's Silent Hill. Right?
Okay.
And he's he does $80 million movies, Euro movies in France. It's a big, big guy. And he was like the opposite of Stewart. In a way, he was a critic. He started as a critic in France, like a lot of French directors. Had a TV show about genre movies. And he had so many references for movies. So every shot he did was a reference to a movie. Everything was, but what was, and it would be incredible, but what was really tricky was getting it to all kind of add up to a clear and satisfying story.
Quentin Tarantino does that pretty well.
Tarantino is really great at being entertaining.
Oh yeah.
I'm not so sure I'm convinced that everything is a proper story, but certainly super. I mean, every scene of his movies just entertained.
Oh yeah.
Whereas with Stewart, Christoph, it was always really hard to get that story to work.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so much going on. And it was all so cinematic. But with Stewart, he wasn't he wasn't driven by fantastic shots, or, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
He was driven by the actors and the interplay between them. And if you look at his best stuff, it's just 5 actors probably, a handful of sets, and good photography, but nothing so special.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And I think most people go into directing, and you want to do that really cool shot. You know, Stuart's idea, I think when we were preparing Reanimator, he used to come over and I had a projection TV and we had laser discs. And we would watch horror movies. So we just, we spent a lot of nights just watching horror movies. And the one that we watched more than once, a few times, was Rosemary's Baby. And that, you can see that he thought that's the kind of style that could work.
Mm.
And with Rosemary's Baby, it's all kind of on the shoulder. It's all following Rosemary around. Almost every shot in the movie has Rosemary.
Right.
So it's very much, and when you're over someone's shoulder, it's like it's their POV. But it's not a POV like looking on Skype.
Mm-hmm.
A POV that includes the presence of the character.
Right.
That you're kind of identifying with. If it's a clean POV, it almost is jarring and can seem a bit,
because it's not human.
Well, life isn't quite like that. I mean, we always have a sense of our presence when we're seeing. Mm-hmm. It can be our glasses, or there's some sort of sense you see part of your body. But in a movie, you kind of need to know where you are, and you kind of have to, and being over the shoulder. There's also an idea with over the shoulder and following people around that somehow, hey, life doesn't have edits. But life does have edits. We blink our eyes.
Right.
And often we're actually editing to the next bit, So, and you choose which bits you want to put into your memory, to your narrative.
Right.
But if you'll notice it got to be, Stewart kind of dropped that a little as years went by, but certainly on Reanimator, Dolls, and From Beyond, it's very much, it was always put it on the shoulder, go over their shoulder. And Mac Allberg kind of tempered that. So Mac Allberg was the DP, and he was sort of almost a father figure for Stewart.
Oh, wow.
He was of another generation. He's Swedish. And he was able to just very quietly kind of convince Stewart of doing, we used to have a lot, like on Reanimator, we were always worried about the coverage. When you're first starting movies, the big danger is you won't have enough shots to cut together for the scene.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to incorporate that. Somehow after years, it becomes just part of the way you think of movies and stuff. But when you start, it's really a new kind of idea, crossing the line. All these things are it's movie language by two-dimensional recording. But after you do it a lot and you get into problems, you kind of incorporate it into your thinking. Well, Mac he had worked with Bergman, he was so experienced that when he came on the set, Stewart, when we might need a cutaway, a close-up, and Stewart only wants to do the over the shoulder.
Because of Rosemary's Baby.
Well, no, I think it's because he got the idea. I think it's because he had learned on plays the way you have a voice in a play, I'm just inventing this, but the way you have a voice, the way you have a point of view, is by taking an idea and sticking with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you look at Dagon, which I think is a great Lovecraft adaptation, it's the last movie I produced that Stewart directed. The one thing that he said from the beginning, he said, it's always going to be raining. Okay, that's like over the shoulder. In that movie, it's pretty much, and that was a bitch to shoot because it was winter.
Oh man!
On the western coast of Spain, so it's really cold when you have rain towers, and everybody's wet. The crew is wearing, it's freezing cold. But when you look at that, another director, me for example, having more of a producer mind anyway, I'd probably be going, well, we can't put everybody through all this. We'll find a way to deal with it, But Stewart just decided it's always going to be wet, it's always going to be raining, and it was always raining. And it was miserable. It was really, really miserable. But you know what? When you watch that movie, there's a continuity to it because of that.
Yeah.
That is like a style. It's like a voice to the movie. And I think that's the way, maybe something like an Over the Shoulder, or it's like maybe when Bernard Herrmann said Psycho will only have strings, the whole score, only strings.
Yeah.
That's why would you do that? Right? Because those types of decisions can make a movie or a score have a point of view.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a bad thing. What the problem would come up is that sometimes those POV, that over the shoulder, if you're not experienced, you'll be surprised when all of a sudden in the editing room, that scene is really dragging and you got nowhere to go. Of course, today you can do a jump cut or anything, but I mean, today you can do anything. But if you think about, then you're kind of like, gee, where do we go to? That's an early problem you have when you're directing or just making movies. And it also is exacerbated by the fact that when you see something on set that you're watching yourself being performed, it always goes faster than it does when it's in the editing on screen. It goes because more, I don't know, maybe it's because it's 3D, maybe for some reason you're involved with it. It's different than what it is. Like a lot of times on a set, there'll be a take where the crew will applaud, some performance or something. And then when you get into the editing room, the editor goes, well, that one doesn't work. It's just what's happening right there is different from necessarily what happens when you have put it into 2 dimensions. And it's maybe not, it's not working the way you thought. Well, Mac Alberg would just kind of very quietly to Stewart saying, I think you might want a close-up of so-and-so on this. And from Mac, he would take it. Mac stood it up, you'd get your close-up, and because Mac knew how things went, and he, from the very beginning, really appreciated that Stewart was a real talent. Because Mac did a lot of independent horror movies, worked with Empire a lot. And so a lot of that stuff, it has its level,
right,
as everything does. And it's not like a huge movie where if you've got a big movie, not only do you have really high-end technicians, so at least the sets are going to be really great. The photography, everything, even if the movie doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, they'll go back and reshoot it. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, go reshoot it. Well, imagine that on an independent horror movie.
There's your budget.
You just do what you've got. You don't reshoot it.
Yeah.
you know. And hey, we were lucky on Reanimator that I was able to pull together the money to do the insert, the shots of the ending that we needed, and do the prologue, which I became convinced was really important. So you didn't have to wait 15 minutes to find out this was going to be a gory movie.
Yeah.
You know,
I like when horror movies start off with something shocking right off the bat. I don't like waiting for it. Obviously, there's exceptions like Jaws being another big one. Although you don't wait that. You wait a long time to see the shark. You don't wait long to see like gore.
With Jaws, they start with a B movie, a big B movie.
Yeah, that's right. They do.
That was really exploitative. I mean,
oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Super exploitative. But I know what you're talking about. On the low budget, very often. Well, today I'm always surprised at how much time horror movies take to get going.
Oh yeah,
it just because and it's done on purpose. It's not like, I see it all the time when I work with people who are a lot younger than me and work on a script or something. I'm always surprised at how much patience they have for getting the story going. And I have to think that there's an acceptance of that. And I think the style that I kind of came up in, that I was a part of, was a style that was much more pulpy and kind of theme park ride.
Yeah.
It was much more funhouse kind of movie making.
And I missed that. I feel like there's not been a lot of that lately.
I think that, I don't think it's because people can't do it. I sometimes think it's maybe two things. One thing is that I always think that it's very cheap to shoot now.
What's that?
It's a lot of footage. You can, with the digital, you just run the camera all the time. But also, I think it certainly is working with the audiences. Because, a lot of the popular horror movies are very slow to get going. I think maybe it's a kind of a mainstreamization of horror. I don't know. It's just a different sensibility.
Yeah.
It tends to, sometimes it works great, but for me, it tends to be, sometimes I just think it's pretentious.
That kind of art house horror. When it's done right, it's great, but I get impatient with certain movies.
Yeah, but one movie I liked in the last 10 years was the Cabin in the Woods. I know it's a send-up.
So good. That was so much fun.
It's not. I get it that it's a riff, totally referential.
Yeah.
Kind of like the horror movies of the last 30 years.
Which is what was wonderful about it. It hit every single note for horror fans.
It did. It delivered from the beginning.
Oh yeah.
It just kept delivering on. I know it's a send-up, but it just kept delivering, and that shows me that, of course, people know how to do it.
They totally do.
They do know how to do it.
Yeah.
It's just not what they want to do now. Even something like what was that one, Crimson
Peak, the Guillermo del Toro.
Yeah, huge money.
Oh yeah,
man, stuff. And I don't know when it got started.
Yeah, I felt the same way.
Don't know. It's not that I need to have everything be in my face, but even a movie like, did you see the Spanish movie The Orphanage?
I did.
That's very slow.
Yeah, it is.
But it starts from the beginning. It's delivering.
Yeah.
It doesn't have this huge pace, but or how about a movie that's very slow, but it's totally in the aesthetic of like the 80s kind of stuff, which is The Autopsy of Jane Doe.
That was a good one. I enjoyed that.
There's a movie where the first 30 minutes, they're just standing around a table, an old guy and his son.
Right.
Who would write a story about that? It's like, boy, this is not your demographic here. they're cutting open a corpse and talking while they're doing it. The opening stinger is kind of really underdone. It's kind of like a kind of a edited out like Law and Order thing. And then all of a sudden you're down there and it is really slow, but for some reason it just works, and on a completely pulpy level.
Yeah.
Absolutely pulp, totally not pretentious in one bit. You don't see a director signing it all over the screen. You don't see shots that are like, oh, look at this shot. It's just like, whoa, this is really creepy. That's Stewart with more story.
That's an interesting way to put it. Great. Well, Brian, I can't thank you enough for your time. This was really wonderful. Any parting words about Stewart or fun stories to share?
I don't know. I always think about when we were shooting Dolls. This is about how determined he is. He was a bull. He was like a bull. When I picked him up at the airport when he came out to LA to do Reanimator, I think we were down in, was it John Wayne Airport down in Orange County? I don't know why it was there. I have no idea. But I went and picked him up, and Stewart showed up. I think Carolyn was with him, if I'm not mistaken. And he had this like leather jacket on, and he was like this Chicago tough guy. He was like a Chicago street guy. And that was a part of Stewart that I don't think anybody ever saw. But he really was a Chicago guy. And he really had this kind of idea of being tough and everything. Because you always look at him and you say, no, Stewart's a big teddy bear. He says, well, yeah. I guess Hell's Angels turn into teddy bears too, right?
It's a whole other side of Stewart. Wow. That's great.
He had his whole thing going, It was and I remember when we were shooting Dolls, he was so determined. That was a tough shoot. And towards the end, he just wouldn't stop shooting. He just didn't. The schedule was too tight. This was a movie that Charlie Band was paying for, and so you kind of had to go with what they said. And Charlie was just like, no, can't. And so we had to stop shooting, and Stewart just wouldn't stop. And no, Stewart was a real, the crew always liked him. They were right with him. And Mac was shooting, and we had the same guys for those three movies. And then we had the rest of the crew was Italian. This was in Rome. We were shooting the inserts of the Dolls, and the line producer, the Italian line producer, just decided, well, screw them. I'm just going to tell the props house they can come and get their props.
Wow.
And so they showed up with their truck, and they were all wearing these, in Europe they wear these little white smocks that workers wear, these white jackets, And so they all kind of start coming in to the stay, and we were working in a big sound stage, and they come in and start carrying out the furniture, because in Dolls it was all this antique type furniture. They start carrying the furniture, and Stewart is shooting. We're in a room, the bedroom or something, and he's shooting a doll on the chair. Okay, right there. And then he says, okay, put it over here, and they're moving there. And the guy and the props house guys come and take the sofa away before they can put the doll down.
Oh God.
That's what's going on. And Stewart won't stop. And he just goes, okay, over there. And whoop, and they shoot it over there. And I thought, boy, that is Stuart Gordon.
Wow. Well, that's wonderful. Well, that's a perfect place to end. But I did have one question. You said that the crew was always very much with Stewart, and I feel like a lot of directors, in a lot of cases, it's difficult to really earn that loyalty of your crew. How do you think Stewart did that? What was it about him that made crews so loyal to him?
I think the crew wants to believe in the director. They want it. They want to think that they're on something good. And I think you have to have the key, their leader. See, the crew is made up, like the grips have a key grip. The gaffers have a key gaffer, have the head gaffer. The DP runs all of them, right? He's got his camera crew, and then the gaffer talks to the DP about what to do. He tells his guy, he tells the key grip, he tells his guys. So that's kind of the shooting crew. And that's the camera, the lights and all that. Then the art department isn't as, you'll have they call him a production designer now, but back then they were called an art director. And they would get they'd find out what you wanted for costuming, for props, for what everything should look like, makeup. So all the people who directly deal with the director, he has to win them over. And they have to feel like he knows what he's doing. And the worst thing that can happen is for the crew to think the director doesn't know what he's doing. Or that it's okay for a director to be kind of a tyrant, because people will put up with it if they think the guy knows what he's doing. If they think it's going to be good stuff, you'll put up with it. You'll work for somebody and you'll put up with abuse if you think it's worth it. Where it gets into trouble is if you have a director who doesn't communicate well, who comes off as maybe being not clear about what he wants, not knowing what he wants. I'm going to say he, it could be a woman. It can be that the producer is not respected. That'll always screw things up, right? If the crew is being abused in some way. But sometimes, you just get the wrong people. And one thing that Stewart does, and say someone like Clint Eastwood does, is that they tend to want to use the same people all the time. So, for example, Stewart, once he worked with Mac Ahlberg, he wanted Mac to do all his movies. And Mac was working with, I think it was William Boyd. Well, he, as his focus puller, he wanted him to be his first assistant camera. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. They try to keep their crew that they want their gaffer. They want somebody they already know how to work with. They want to have the director or producer wants to have that art director that they've worked with before. And even the actors. The Stewart came from theater. So in theater, it's a troupe.
Right. It's
a group of people. They're almost like a family. And so that family is in theater, as I understand it, traditionally, a theater would put on different plays. They'd say, okay, you play this, you play that, but it's the same actors. It's the same costumer. It's the same stage manager. And it's a troupe that does that. That's something I understand that Clint Eastwood does. He always has the same DP. He knows when he goes out there, he doesn't have to argue with anybody about anything. I'm not like that. I've always liked to work with different people because I always feel like I don't come from theater. And I always think, man, if it's all left up to me, I don't have that many ideas,
Yeah.
Most people only have one idea. If you've got two, you're pretty damn special. If you're three, maybe you're a genius. So, you'll end up doing the same thing all the time. But if I always think, hey, and plus I was like collaborating. Hey, I want to try, see what this DP, this composer, these actors. I mean, of course you like the people you like, but it's always kind of interesting to see what'll happen. And I think with Stewart, he was able to take what his ability to connect. He ran a theater, and people all were with him. And it's not like people don't have some horror stories about Stuart Gordon. It's just their war stories when it all works. When you win the war, it's war stories.
Yeah.
It's the war you don't even want to hear about it, And I think the work was so good that you kind of go, yeah, I'm on board. You quit resisting. You go, yeah, I want to do this. Where it gets tricky is when you do bigger movies then, and you start having people involved, actors involved, like with Reanimator, Dolls, From Beyond. There was no actor in those movies that carried any weight within the deal, right? But when Stewart went to do Space Truckers, all of a sudden he's dealing with real personalities that are pushing back. I think it's kind of like when what's his name did Dune.
David Lynch.
David Lynch, when he did Dune, he took the whole crew out and he showed them Eraserhead, so they could see his work. Now all of a sudden people are going, what is going on here? And and I think Dune, I think a lot of the later Star Wars movies just completely, I would say, borrow from Dune. There's incredible stuff there, but it didn't quite work in total. There was brilliant stuff. And I think part of that was because all of a sudden you're in this huge story, and how do you do a war scene when you're David Lynch? It's a whole, when you do those huge scenes, there's second unit directors, there's certain directors who know how to manage. It's like being a general for war, whereas a genre movie director, the great ones, I think, they're more like second lieutenants.
Yeah.
They've got a platoon. They know every one of the soldiers, and they all have personal loyalty to them. But when you start getting into bigger projects, that starts breaking down, and it becomes, then the politics will get bad. But I think you have to first start with kind of communicating a clear vision and communicating a competence of it. And the crew wants to go on the trip. They want to go on the voyage. But you can't make them think that you don't know what you're doing. That'll bring it down fast. But Stewart was pretty much, the crews always really loved him.
Great. Well, Brian, such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Larry Fessenden is an American director, producer, writer, and actor. Larry's career highlights include Habit, Wendigo, The Last Winter, and 2019's Depraved. I always love speaking to Larry. As far as indie filmmakers go, Larry is so much the real deal, and I like to call him the East Coast Corman because he's not only a prolific director, but he's mentored and groomed multiple other great directors like Ty West, Jen Wexler, and Jim Mickle. Larry and Stewart never actually got to work together on a film, which is extremely unfortunate. But for years, they had a number of projects that they were developing. This conversation was mostly about what Stewart inspired in Larry as a filmmaker, as well as some details about those lost projects that they were working on that never came to see the light of day. There's lots of great wisdom here. Please enjoy this reflection on Stuart Gordon with the great Larry Fessenden. Let's, obviously we're here to talk about Stewart. I feel like it might be cool to start with what was your first viewing of Reanimator like?
Well, actually, remember, I saw it in a theater. And the funny thing is I remember From Beyond as well. which I saw on 42nd Street, or something really scuzzy.
Ooh, that's How to See from Beyond.
Yeah, exactly. But honestly, Reanimator I preferred, and I mean that was just such an amazing introduction. What I loved was the sense of really theatrical staging. You really sensed in his filmmaking that he did come from a theatrical background, because a lot of the talking head in the tray, all of that stuff felt just really fresh. It didn't feel forced. I mean, of course, 80s had pretty cool effects, even, Nightmare on Elm Street. Everything was a little more tactile.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Stewart had a sort of a grace with it and a plum. Then, of course, there was Barbara Crampton, who was very hot, and that seemed like also a sort of a fun sense of humor. Everything about that movie was very captivating, and it's funny how you can make a classic, and then that becomes why I said I'm a Stuart Gordon fan. I sensed his energy and his point of view in that one movie,
mm-hmm.
and then I kept up with him, but not religiously over the years. You know what movie I really liked was a later film of his called Stuck.
That's the one I haven't seen.
I really recommend it. It's also like a chamber piece. First of all, it's a very singular situation. You never leave the car because the guy is stuck in the car.
Mm-hmm.
It's profound, and it's a real moral, morality-based kind of dilemma that the character is in. So I found that also it could have been a one-act play.
Right.
Like Stewart comes back to his origins in
mm-hmm.
that way. And you can feel it in the movies, and I just have a great fondness for that world. And of course, he used the same actors, and then so you had a sense of an ensemble and a community. That's something that he put out, and that's before I met him. And once I met him, I really had a sense of exactly that he was very personable, and we tried to work together. He really liked what Glass Eye Pix was doing, making independent movies, and he thought somehow that we could help him.
Mm-hmm.
The funny thing was that I think even at his level, that his sense of what a low budget was a little bit higher than even what we were doing as scrappy up and comers.
Mm-hmm.
He had been on the block, so we expected $1 million or something in that range, because that's what he was used to. He was very professional. So we tried to launch two projects, and they were, when you get into it with a filmmaker like Stuart Gordon, you're starting to picture it, and you're talking about, even if you're dealing with the very beginning stages, and you're basically talking about when you find the money, you still there's always going to be conversations about, won't this be cool? And it was a really strange movie about shadows that move across the city, and creatures hiding in the shadows, and you have to pass this affliction from one person to the other. I mean, I'm not totally clear in my mind. I suppose I could look through the old emails, but it was very evocative, and I couldn't wait to do this with Stewart. It just seemed so exciting.
It was going to be in New York? You were going to film in New York?
Yeah, and that was part of it. He was excited to come to the city and sort of join our posse. He was really supportive, and in other words, it was reciprocal. I was excited to hear from him and work with him, and he really felt that he could get some juice from our camp and our people. In a weird way, what ended up happening is that the closest we came to working together, which was very dear, was doing A Tale from Beyond the Pale, which is our radio plays. So he brought the band together. He had Barbara Crampton, he had his composer and his writer, and they did an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's The Hound, and they recorded in L.A. My partner, Glenn McQuaid, my partner in the radio plays, was there working with Stewart, and then I got to play the Hound, which he was delighted to. We just had a fun time working on that together, and he really rode Glenn very hard. He was very particular.
Yeah.
And it felt like he came from a little bit of a, whatever world he built, whatever community he built, he was in charge. He was a man of stature.
Yeah.
No, he's not Ridley Scott or even Romero, but although he had a similar humility as Romero, this is what I say is the horror icons we're all sort of outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
We all struggled. We do struggle. And I mean, that's why Stuart King, the Glass Eye picks. That's when you're desperate.
I've heard that from many people who've worked with him, that he's very commanding, sometimes demanding, but he's also very, very humble at the same time. Yeah. And those seem like paradoxical qualities, but it seems like he was able to strike that fine balance, which feels rare in a director.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, he reminded me of Romero, maybe generationally, maybe that they felt like outsiders in their craft. Hollywood has disdain for horror. It's somewhat changing now, but believe me, in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, you were an outsider if you were making horror. Only Wes Craven was able to sort of break through, but nobody took him seriously. He spent years trying to make a non-horror film, the famous musical with Meryl Streep,
right,
about violins or whatever, and no one would let him out of his cage. We're all in the cage once you get into the horror genre.
It's not a bad cage, as far as I'm concerned.
I like the cage. It's okay. But there you have it. So Stewart, I don't actually recall Stewart ever wanting to get out of that cage. He seemed always to have a very devilish, mischievous sense of humor. And, he did a play at the end of his years,
mm-hmm.
The Cannibal, the German cannibal who ate his boyfriend's privates and onwards. And I just think it's pretty cool. I mean, people were apparently like gasping and vomiting in the theater. So I think
he never lost it.
Yeah, he never lost it. Oh no, he was very mischievous. So that was my direct experience, was doing the radio play with him, and then we finally met after many years on the telephone. We met at the Stanley Film Festival. It was very nice to finally really hang out with him for a bit. But just a real influence in terms of these pillars of the horror community that you really, the secret I always say of the horror community is we're very, it's really a tight group. We share a common appreciation for the macabre, and that makes us feel like outsiders, and therefore we, stick together. I mean, let's say that's how it always has been. I don't know what the current climate will bring, but that's sort of this generation, Stewart's generation, really, I think, took solace in the fans, how much they cared about him and how iconic, his big features were.
Yeah. Yeah, he seemed like he was able to kind of nurture a community of outsiders and let a lot of younger horror filmmakers know that it's okay to be an outsider and there's a place for you in the horror community, which is wonderful.
Yeah, it's, well, I always say it's a very nurturing community. It has been for decades in any case, because we're all sort of outside looking in at the Hollywood system, and we're all disparaged. And yet, we make consistently, horror always makes money in some faction or some version of making money, and so it's a fine place to reside.
Yeah, for sure. Were there any big lessons you took from Stewart as a director? Because you're obviously a pretty accomplished director. Was there anything that he taught you as a director?
As I say, the thing I liked about Stewart is the way he staged. I mean, just speaking of The Animator, there was a sense of humor, but it wasn't campy in the way that sometimes can be a little self-conscious and pandering.
Right.
It was more almost satire, which is a much subtler flavor. And yet, as I say, there was something in his staging which was just very matter of fact. And also didn't fetishize the effect. It just presented it. I don't know. As I say, I really think it had a lot to do with a theater background where
Mm-hmm.
your main agenda is to figure out the tricks so that you can pull it off. And then he would film it. So there was a sort of an effortlessness. And, there are many other types of filmmakers who would do that stuff differently. Like I say, the Freddy Krueger movies, you really can feel the effort there to create some of the.
Yeah.
It's also very wonderful practical effects, but it's sort of like, all right, here we go.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about Stewart that was. So it's just to say that would be the flavor. I mean, if you're going to learn from every director, it's fun to see what that perspective they bring to it, and also it speaks to something I believe, which is you could feel his personality on screen.
Mm-hmm.
His warmth, his mischievousness, his inventiveness, and this sense of, well, just fucking do it.
Yeah.
Well, he was also, as I say, he enjoyed. He was also very naughty. I mean, he used Barbara, and the beautiful thing is that Barbara is a woman who he enjoyed playing that role for him. In subsequent movies, and even in the radio play, there's a sex scene that they added. Stewart obviously said, "Well, we have to have a sex scene," and it was like randomly in a H.P. Lovecraft movie, she's like a dominatrix. It's
Naturally.
clearly something that Stewart just had this idea in the middle of the night. So I just found all of that very charming.
Yeah. Yeah, a common theme of these conversations when people are talking about Stewart is how much his theater background enabled him as a director, and sleight of hand tricks like the ones used on Reanimator, and also how he took things so seriously. I mean, Reanimator, everybody played it straight, which is why it makes that movie so magical. It has bonkers concepts, but it's so grounded with actors that are in the moment and they're taking it completely seriously. And he rehearsed the hell out of that thing also.
That's also theater. And maybe that helps me sort of know that what I'm trying to express is that you feel you're watching something that's crafted.
Yeah.
It's not like they just threw it together, the old cliche, oh, it was an indie film, they just did it real quick. You feel like this is completely, someone is in control of what's going down.
Yeah.
That really, and the effects, it was all very considered.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it extremely appealing, and it just instantly stood out, and you were always curious, what was he going to do next?
Yeah.
I mean, I know he did Dolls, and he did a bunch of other really individual, very specifically personality everywhere you turn. His picture.
That was definitely him. Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. Is there anything we didn't touch on regarding Stewart that you'd want to mention? Any other?
Well, I've said this about Stewart, but in our calls, building this potential of movies, I really had a sense of him wanting to do the work and being a little bit frustrated that it wasn't always easy to raise the money or whatever whatever the blocks were that were keeping him from just getting to work. So I think once again you have a filmmaker who would probably have rather made more films, but he soldiered on, and he was always looking for solutions. I suspect that's why he ended up doing some theater at the end as well, because he knew that he could count on a smaller budgeted production, and he just wanted to do the creative work. And that's why we even began talking, and it was really a fun. It was fun to see him willing to explore and find solutions. Though I'll work with this cool company; they seem to be getting things done. Also, another thing he did that I thought was very sweet is in the press he highlighted my piece in ABCs of Death 2, which 26 filmmakers, and he just randomly said that mine was one of the best. And he didn't call me and say he wasn't gaining anything by going out on the limb for me. So I like his sensibility that he sort of saw mine as. So I guess what I'm getting at is I felt like we had some simpatico, which is why we enjoyed scheming together.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could have seen what you guys would have come up with.
Oh, me too, man. I still think about that one movie, and then we even tried a whole second movie, but that one I don't remember. Anyway, but that's, I love Guillermo del Toro. His quote is, "The natural state of a film is it's not getting made." I mean, it's a very awkward statement, but when you realize the weight of it, it is so heartbreaking. Because it's so cool. We could do podcasts of movies that I haven't made. It would be very long podcast.
Yeah, there is a podcast called The Greatest Movies Never Made, and it's all about like these movies that almost happened.
No doubt. And there's a whole project. And it's funny because I did an interview for Depraved for that.
Oh,
a separate project, but in that same vein of horror movies that were never made. For example, Romero famously wanted to make a mummy movie.
Right.
Which, I mean, in a way, we're all blessed he didn't get to it.
It's Clive Barker and Mick Garris were going to do one too, and Steve Johnson was doing the effects.
What is with the mummy? I don't know. I've never had an appeal, but yeah. So I did an interview for Depraved, and then I beg your pardon. I said in the middle of the interview, "Excuse me, the difference is I'm actually going to make this." So, nevertheless, yeah, Stewart probably had a lot of tricks up his sleeves that he never got to, and it's one of the tragedies and one of the realities of filmmaking.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a tragedy. Well, Larry, thank you for taking some time to reflect on Stewart. It's really been wonderful to hear, so thank you.
Thanks, man. Very good.
Graham Skipper is an American actor, director, and writer. He's directed multiple horror movies, including Space Clown and Sequence Break, which is now streaming on Shudder. He also reprised the role of Dr. Herbert West in Reanimator the Musical and starred in multiple Joe Begos movies, including Almost Human and The Mind's Eye. Graham worked really closely with Stewart on Reanimator the Musical and was lucky enough to have developed a very close relationship with him. There are multiple wonderful lessons that Graham learned from Stewart, and he was gracious enough to share them with me. So please enjoy this conversation about Stuart Gordon with Graham Skipper. Can you talk about your working relationship with Stewart for those who might not be familiar?
Yeah, so back in, I want to say 2010, I had the great fortune of being cast as Herbert West in Reanimator the Musical. I had gotten invited to audition through our mutual friend George Wendt, who I knew from my New York comedy days.
That is Norm from Cheers, right?
That's Norm from Cheers, yes. And George had become a friend of mine and a sometimes collaborator. And he basically called me one day and he said, "Hey, have you ever heard of the movie Reanimator?" And I, being a lifelong horror fan, I said, "Yes, of course." And he said, "Do you know the director, Stuart Gordon?" And I said, "Yes, of course." And he said, "Well, he's going to call you in about 15 minutes. And I said, "Holy shit." And I spoke to Stewart, and basically Stewart was like, "Yeah, we'd love to have you, can you come out to LA and can you, come and audition for the show?" And so I did, and I read for it, and I got it. And it was just such an incredible experience from day one. Stewart, although he's certainly, best known for being, a legendary horror director. Stewart was also a legendary theater director,
right?
The Organic Theater Company in Chicago. And so, although I was familiar with Stewart's work as a filmmaker, walking into the rehearsal room with him and getting to see that part of his process as my first introduction to him as a person, just was really special. And we did Reanimator the Musical off and on for 5 years. And we toured all over the world together. Stewart was always there. Stewart, was very hands-on. I mean, Stewart would lead us in a warm-up before every show and before every rehearsal. Stewart ran the light board for much of the run of the show.
Oh, wow.
He, it was amazing. Like, you think of this legendary director and and people would come up to me and say, "Oh, where's Stewart?" And I'd say, "Oh, he was back there." They're like, "Wait, the guy running the lights?" Like, yeah, him. He was extremely hands on, and he really cared about what he was doing, and he, always had this sort of I don't know if you call it a mantra, but this sort of perspective that you can always make a show better. And so he always really worked toward that. And of course throughout that process, he became a good close friend. After the show ended, we remained in touch and would have lunch, every month or so and catch up. And, he remained always very excited to hear about what was going on in my life and interested in all of that. And like when I was making my film Sequence Break, Stewart, I invited Stewart to come over and watch a rough cut of the film and give me his notes, and so Stewart came over and sat on my couch and watched my movie and gave me some incredible notes that were very worthwhile and totally helped to make the film better. So I've just been very, very grateful that, I had such a relationship with him and got to work with him for so long and learn from him. And I miss him very much. I mean, we had lunch probably a month before he passed.
Oh, wow.
And we went to this really great sushi place and just had a really lovely conversation.
He seems like he was a real mentor to a lot of young people in the horror community who were up and coming. And he seemed like a real nurturer in that regard. He
absolutely was. Yeah. I mean, he, I met Joe Begas working for Stewart. Joe was Stewart's personal assistant for many years. And then he was the stage manager for Reanimator the Musical. So that's how Joe and I met.
Oh, all right.
But it's the same thing with, Stewart always took a chance on talent that wasn't yet proven, but he could see something in people, and he wasn't afraid to give the lead role of this iconic character in a musical to essentially a total unknown. That's he gave me a shot, and it's what gave me my career. And as I look through his history with all of his films and everything he did, I mean, that's a pattern, and it's a real special quality, in a person to be able to be willing to take chances like that. And it seems like he always was.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all. He seemed to have such a sweet side to him, and just really care about people in a big way and care about the horror community. And I think it's mentorship speaks volumes when you hear about people who really dedicate a lot of time and effort and energy to nurture other people in their industry. I think that's enormous. Were there any big lessons that you learned from him as a director?
I mean, I think the two biggest things I would say are that one is that character must come first, that it's all about the characters, and it's all about, making sure that people believe in what's happening to those characters in order for the rest of the movie to fall into place. Reanimator only works as a movie because all of the actors are playing it so earnestly.
Right.
If you played that movie as a slapstick comedy, it doesn't work. And Stewart knew that. And that's something that you'll see in every single one of his films, is that, the characters are all very true and feel very real and very grounded.
Yeah.
And while, yes, we were doing Reanimator the Musical, and yes, a part of that was that we were big and that it had like sort of a grand guignol spectacle kind of vibe to it. And it was, purposefully there are some goofy things in it that are funny because of the format of the thing that we're doing. It was never silly for silly's sake. It always was rooted in the emotion of the moment and in the type of thing that we were making.
Right.
And that was always, just the thing with him was everything stemmed from character. And in addition to that, Stewart, he had a motto, which was more is more. And I think what that means is that, always go bigger, always make the big, bolder choice, always go as far as you can, more blood, more screaming, and more energy, more everything, and he would have this amazing knack to somehow get you to give him more of something and then pinpoint the little things where, okay, now pull back a little bit on that glance, or okay, in this little moment, be just a touch more subtle. And then he could really craft it. But he was never afraid to go big, and he was never afraid to do something totally insane. It was like I remember we had a gag at the beginning of the musical where we would sing. We had a splash zone in the first few rows of the audience.
Naturally.
And blood would spray on them and whatever. And we had this bit where we'd be singing this opening song, then the cast would hand me a bucket, and the bucket had blood in it. And I remember at the beginning, he had me like, we were like trying to splash the blood on like a lot of the front row, and it was sort of diluting the power of it. And he said, well, first we need to put more blood in there. And second, why don't you just dump it all on one person? and we were like, is that too much? And he was like, no, of course not. It's never too much. You're holding a bucket of blood in your hand. Like, empty the whole thing onto somebody.
And they signed up.
And so that's what we did, and it was totally the right choice. But I think, like I carried that into Sequence Break, where, we just said, look, we're making this thing on a low budget, and we want this film to be as impactful and as interesting as possible. So in every single department, make the bolder choice. Whatever it is, make the bolder choice. Because I believe that that's what Stewart would have done, and I know that that's what Stewart would have done. I will say this too. I did ask him for advice the day before we started shooting. I called him and I said, what advice would you give me? And he said, well, I'll give you the same advice that Roger Corman gave first-time filmmakers, which is wear comfortable shoes and sit down often. And I'll tell you, that's great advice.
Yeah. Well, I got to return to the idea of always go bigger and go bolder, because I mean, what that indicates is if you push things further, you might not use that in the actual final film, whatever you get out of it, but you'll force the actors or you'll force the scene to reveal certain things that you can then either reel in, or it'll reveal new material that otherwise wouldn't have been there, had you played it small. So there's so many little nuances about him as a director. And when it comes to horror directing, there's the level of quality that he seemed to really focus on getting out of his actors it seems to really distinguish him. And I would hear about the really comprehensive rehearsals that he would go through with all of his actors. I mean, clearly a lot of this stems from his theater background, but he brought such a level of realism and focused on just fine performances from his actors in a genre that's not always, necessarily known for their performances. But I think you're right. I think that's part of the magic of Reanimator, the fact that the entire cast played it straight. And it makes that movie sing versus if it was something a little more campy, But
I agree. And, just to speak to that, I think that, that's the thing that stands out about all of his films is that, his movies go to some pretty wacky places. But somehow you buy them. Every single one, you totally buy it. And it's because the performances are also grounded, and I remember, he would say something to us when we were rehearsing. And of course we were doing theater, but he would say something to us that was, if somebody would grumble about like taking time to warm up before a show or something, he'd say, well, don't you want to do this? Don't you want the show to be as good as possible? And I'd say, yeah, you know what? Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. And same goes with like typically in a stage show, once the show opens, it's more or less frozen, and the director no longer gives you notes. It's just kind of like that's typical practice. And Stewart would give us, a note before every show. He would come up and he would give us a little something. And I remember, we'd been doing the show off and on for 5 years, and it was our very final performance in Las Vegas, and what would turn out to be the very final performance we'd ever do at the show. And he came up to me and he said, hey, Graham, I have a note for you. I want you to try something a little different. And he gave me like this little adjustment in one of my songs. I said, Stuart, it is the last show. It's the very last show. You know, what are you
Hardcore.
talking about? And he said, well, yeah, it's the last time you get to try this.
I love the logic there. Yeah, it speaks to quality and having fun.
Yeah, and having fun. Like, that's the thing. He found the joy in performing, or the joy in creating theater, and the joy in creating this work. And he took great pride in it. I mean, I remember a story. We were we for a time were doing these 2-show days, and we'd perform a show at like 8 p.m. and then we'd have like a 2-hour break, and then we'd perform a show at midnight. It was something like that. And one night, we finished the first show, and Stewart had brought in a TV on, like, one of those things like you might see in a science classroom, like an old school TV sitting on top of a VCR.
Mm-hmm.
He wheeled it in, and he said, hey, and he holds up his VHS of Dolls, his personal VHS, and he says, like this, I don't think that this movie has ever really gotten its full due, and I've always really liked it, and so I thought, I don't know, do you guys want to watch it with me during the break?
On a VHS.
And so
awesome.
We said, yeah, so we sat and we watched, and he gave us a live commentary to Dolls as it was happening.
Oh, that's so
but he
cool.
just wanted to share this cool thing that he'd made.
Yeah.
And he did that often. I mean, he shared so many films with me throughout the years of, like, just different movies he thought that I'd like.
Oh, yeah? Anything come to mind?
Being There.
Okay. Peter Sellers.
First one to pop. Yeah, Peter Sellers, Being There. Oh gosh, there was a movie. What is the name of it? There's a film that takes place. It's an old film. It's black and white, and it takes place in a cemetery, and it's like the cemetery has its own, like, little insulated world.
It's not Plan 9 from Outer Space. No.
It's I'd have to look. I can't. It's escaping me right now. But like, there's another film called that was a more recent one from I want to say Brazil, called Revolucion Toxica.
Ooh.
That he'd seen at some South American film festival, and he just loved it. And it's like this totally bonkers zombie musical.
In Portuguese.
Yeah.
Oh, sign me up.
Yeah, and but it just, he had such eclectic tastes, and he loved all, and he just loved sharing cool stuff with people. I remember, like, we would talk about our favorite movies, and like he would, he said, oh, one of the scariest movies of all time is Cronenberg's Dead Ringers.
What?
Well, yeah. And I was like, that's so great. That's so cool.
Yeah. I never would have, wouldn't have guessed that one, but I can see it now that I think back.
Yeah. Yeah. He's, he was such a supportive guy in the arts, and like he would go to so many events here in here in LA and and elsewhere. Like, he would, if he was at a film festival, he'd be seeing movies. Mm-hmm. He would go and see plays, and that's just something that doesn't necessarily happen, with a lot.
He just loved the horror world, loved the community, was interested in the movies. That's I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. He just genuinely had a passion for the horror community.
Yeah.
That's great. Any other fun or endearing or revealing Stewart stories?
Gosh, I mean, my memories of Stewart are just that, he was so generous with his time and his thoughts and his tutelage. And he was also very generous in terms of allowing it to be a collaborative process. Like, we were always encouraged. I mean, from the moment that I met him, from day one of rehearsal, I'm coming in nervous as hell, just trying to please him. And he was asking me my opinion, what do you think of this? How do you feel about this move? Whatever. And he wouldn't hesitate to say that he disagreed with something. If I,
mm-hmm.
if I said, like, if I said, oh, what about this? He would say, no, I don't think so. But he was, he knew what he wanted.
Yeah.
But he was open to changing it if somebody could convince him. And that's just a very special quality in a director. He genuinely always just wanted it to be as good as possible. And that's evidenced by the fact that the man, ran the light board,
Yeah.
like he wanted each of those moments to be perfect. And he knew that every night in the theater is different. And he wanted to be, crafting this thing with us. And I can tell you honestly, I've never been a part of a show before in my life that created the family that Reanimator did.
Yeah.
I'm still best friends with everyone that did the show. And it was a truly special, sort of moment in time. And as I've talked to other people that have worked with Stewart and other people that knew him, it's clear that that was a pattern in his life of creating a real family around the art and around all these projects. And that goes straight back to him.
Yeah.
He was a really, really special man. And I've been revisiting, like I know a lot of people have, all of his films and just thinking to myself every time, like, wow, it's so rare to see a director who didn't have a single dud in their entire filmography.
Right. Yeah. Do you have a favorite?
My favorite Stuart Gordon movie, if I discount Reanimator, which I have a very close affection for, obviously. Yeah. Gosh, I mean, I love so much From Beyond. I really love, there's a Disney film he did called The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit.
Oh, that's right. That's the one I haven't seen.
It's so wonderful. And he gave me a DVD of it. One of the first times I met him at his office, he was like, I can't remember what it was. We were talking about his films and he was like, oh, have you seen The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit? And I said, I've never even heard of it. And he said, oh, well, I have a couple of these DVDs left. He said, they're out of print, so don't lose it. But here, have this.
Wow. How did that movie even come about? I was always curious.
That movie, how that movie come about? I'm not exactly sure, but as I all that I know about it is that, it's based on a Ray Bradbury short story.
Okay.
And my understanding is that Stewart and Ray Bradbury himself had developed that story into a play back in Chicago.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so I think that Stewart had for a while been trying to get it made into a movie. And then at some point, I'm not exactly sure where I read this or who I heard this from, but that somehow, Bradbury himself, got back involved, and together they were able to convince Disney to come in and make the film. Mm-hmm. And it's a really wonderful movie. I'll tell you that this is actually a fun story. So my sister was going to, it was like the Dallas Comic Con, I think. And Edward James Olmos was going to be there. And of course, my sister and I are both big Battlestar Galactica fans. And so she was going to go meet Edward James Olmos. Well, Edward James Olmos stars in The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit.
Right.
And I said, well, you got to tell him about your connection to Stewart. Because of course, my sister had met Stewart many times and all that. And so she waits in line, she gets up to him and she tells him that she knew Stuart Gordon. And he said, can I tell you something? The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit was my favorite movie I ever worked on.
Wow.
And isn't that something?
Yeah.
And
it's probably all because of him.
Yeah. I mean, it all trickles down, from the director and from, the vibe that they have on set and the work ethic, and like Stewart, I mean, it was, like when we would, like strike the show, like Stewart was the first one there with the drill in his hand,
Yeah.
And when we did the show in Edinburgh, we had to set up the set and break it down every night before and after. And Stewart was right there with us, in his suit, like breaking it down and putting it up.
These kind of things just speak volumes about who a person is. Between that and him operating the light board, I mean, he's Stuart Gordon. He doesn't have to be doing these things, but of course he would be there.
Just to have the kind of leader that would be willing to get their hands dirty and to lead the charge, on these things that a director normally wouldn't be doing. It just inspires everybody else, in the cast and the crew to work that much harder and to devote that much more energy to make this already special thing that much more special. And I think that that's why everything that Stewart ever created, and the relationships that he built, were also strong, is because he really led by example.
Yeah. Well, that's huge. Well, that's a great way to end this. Graham, thank you so much for doing this. Any parting words about Stewart?
I miss Stewart very much. I loved him very much. I'm forever thankful to Stewart for giving me a career. And I'm forever grateful for the friendship that followed. And all I would say to anybody listening is that, every single one of Stewart's films is special and is different and is interesting. And he especially would want you to seek out, some of the lesser known stuff, because he was very proud of all of it. But yeah, we all, should raise a glass to Stu and be grateful that what he left behind is a body of work that's not just super entertaining, but inspiring, to young indie filmmakers and artists that just want to create something bonkers. He proved you can, and it'll live forever.
I'll drink to that. Thanks, Graham.
Nick, thanks so much. I really appreciate you giving me the chance to talk about him.
All right, guys. Thank you as always for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with your friends and family on social media? Don't forget to follow the show on the Instagrams at I'm Nick Taylor. That's I am Nick Taylor, and on Twitter at the same handle. Thanks again for listening to the Nick Taylor Horror Show.